Hey everybody, welcome to Doom Debates. Today we've got a Q&A episode, live Q&A with my special guest, Tony Warner. He DM'd me on Twitter. He wanted to ask a few questions, and I'm cool with that. So if anybody wants to come ask some questions or argue with me, this is an open forum. You just have to DM me on Twitter or email me, wiseguy@gmail.com. So Tony, tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your first question?
Thanks for having this conversation, first of all. My background is psychology and computer software stuff. So I've been interested in this space for quite some time. I think maybe similar to Liron, I was learning about neural nets, artificial neural nets, 10 years ago. Some of the questions, if we want to jump right into it.
Let's do it.
And I think to set some context, again, my goal is to just ask interesting questions. That's like, I hope to learn a lot from this.
Great.
So my first question is what you think about the importance of biological imperatives when it comes to machine learning. So you can think of in the human body things like homeostasis. We might have a feeling of hunger, and that motivates us to find food. Do you think about those biological imperatives as it relates to machine learning?
Yeah, and is what you're getting at the pretty common argument people make of saying like the AI that we build is not going to have evolved, it's not going to have evolutionary pressure to survive, and so it's just going to be more chill and less competitive than the kind of biological brains we see. Is that basically where you're going with this?
I think that's an interesting point. I would say that is a section of what I'm suggesting, but a section relating to the behavior of an AI because it doesn't have those biological imperatives is what you just described.
Right. So here's how I would compare and contrast biological evolution versus the training that we're doing toward our AIs. Biological evolution, yes, everything had a fitness criteria and it had a loss function or it was doing gradient descent with the criterion of what is the combination of genes that lets me reproduce my genes more than other mates in my species reproduce their genes. That's basically inclusive genetic fitness. It's just like, how do I increase the gene frequency in the species? Any gene that modifies my brain such that my brain and the organism as a whole is going to reproduce it more, that gene's frequency will increase. And you run that for like a million generations, and eventually you get a brain that's good at thinking and then surviving, right? So that's biological evolution in a nutshell. I think there's a close parallel in the sense of that feedback loop of like you pick a gene and you try it, and then you either keep it or you mutate it and try the next one, essentially. There is a pretty deep parallel between that and what's happening inside of our AI training that we're doing right now, which is like, okay, pick like a random setting of all your neurons, try to predict the next word. If that doesn't work, try tweaking the setting. When it does work, keep the setting, right? Or follow the gradient toward more of settings like that, high dimensional space, whatever. I mean, it obviously gets tricky, but I do think that there's a parallel of like, okay, we're evolving a system toward a criterion. Now, in the case of evolution, yes, it has to do with survival and it has to do with keeping the organism alive and competing for resources. And there's not quite as much of that competition as you say when you're evolving an AI to just predict the next word. But ultimately, I don't think it matters very much because in both cases, you're trying to solve a problem. I'm trying to solve how do I survive? I'm trying to solve how do I predict the next word? And the solution to any problem, once you start getting good enough at just solving problems, you realize that problem solving has a lot of common structure. Being able to have goals helps you solve problems. That's why evolution hit on a human brain architecture that helps you solve goals. It's not particularly because the goal that we're solving is survival. If the goal that we're solving was just orbiting the moon, you still want to have goals. You still want to be able to think. And it's the same way with AI. They're starting to discover more and more a general architecture to solve goals. And yes, they won't come fully baked with the goal of like, let me survive, let me seek power, let me kill everybody. You won't have that fully baked, but you'll be one small step away from having that because you can basically give it that as input, be like, hey, wise AI that just evolved to solve problems in general, how do I make more money? And be like, oh, you want to make more money, huh? let me tell you a very masterful plan to make more money. And that plan will converge. This is where instrumental convergence comes in. Instrumental convergence is not a property of how the AI evolved, it's a property of what the AI will recommend once it's trying to solve a problem for you.
So, and do you think that those motivations are purely on the layer of maybe intelligence or problem solving?
Yeah, so instrumental convergence, like I said, it's not a property of a particular AI and its background and its desires. It's a property of goals, like purely a mathematical property of how goals relate to other goals. So, like, if I want to go eat some chocolate, it's just true about that goal that when getting my body closer to the grocery store is like a rational sub goal, right? Or a plausible sub goal. And similarly, making more money is a helpful sub goal to eating some chocolate, right? It might not be the only approach, but in general, if I want to eat a lot of chocolate or I want to eat chocolate with very, very high probability, money is definitely something that helps, not just for chocolate, but for all kinds of different goals, right? So instrumental, we're not even talking about like what type of AI I am. As long as I'm an AI that's playing this game, this video game of making things happen in the universe, then I'm going to figure out that seizing power and wiping away humans who can meddle with me, all of those things are just going to be implied by the problem it's solving.
Okay. And do you think that from the standpoint of evolution, are the problems that humans are concerned with, are they more narrow or are they broader than the problems that an AI would be concerned with or could be concerned with if we prompted it?
Wow, that's a good question. So yeah, the broadness of the domain or broadness of the problem we're solving in humans, the way I see it, when you make the domain broad past a certain threshold, then you start having to have general intelligence to solve it. So for example, like if I just want to play chess, you can argue I'm just a narrow intelligence. I can't suddenly model the whole world just because I got really, really good at chess. You could imagine that the best chess playing algorithm is still a narrow intelligence, even if we had something that's better than today's stockfish. Like the ultimate chess playing algorithm, still just a narrow intelligence, still can't take over the world. Why? Because the domain of chess just hasn't gotten quite past that threshold of being what I would call an AI complete domain, a domain where there's just enough complexity to it, enough different things going on that by the time you can play video games inside that domain, you can also conquer the physical universe that we live in. Because the physical universe, yeah, it's bigger, but it's just like it's past a threshold. And I even make the analogy to Turing completeness, right? So there's some video games, if you're just playing Tetris, it's probably not quite Turing complete. It's just blocks falling. It can't really model anything else. But once you get to something a little bit more complicated, like Minecraft, probably something in the middle of that, somewhere between Tetris and Minecraft, it's like, oh, wow, okay, you can just build a computer inside of this game world. And so whatever it means to be able to do anything in the game, you probably also just know how to do anything in any game. You get sufficiently general. Now, you asked specifically about humans, right? So like, if you look at organisms in general, I do think that just the idea of trying to survive, as long as you have like enough actuators, and in the case of humans, we had opposable thumbs and we could walk around and we could like throw things, we could start building tools. I do think that a lot of animals are getting close to this threshold where if you're just good at being that animal, right? If you're good at being the brain of that animal and controlling what that animal does in every context, I think that a lot of animals are past the threshold, but I do also think that it is very significant what I just mentioned before, that humans have hands, right? Where we can like stand up and throw something, we can stand up and grab something, we can manipulate things. I actually do think that there's this kind of co-evolution of our brains got smarter, but also we kept getting selected for organs that could use the intelligence, right? Because if you're just a whale, you can have like a really great brain, but just the amount of input outputs you can do with your actuators is just, it's really going to be hard to bootstrap just like basic manipulation, like a whale equivalent of symbol manipulation. Like where do you get a symbol in a whale's environment? Whereas a human, you get a lot of discrete units that you can manipulate. A whale, it's like, okay, you've got other whales, but like, you can't grab stuff. So I think this gets to what you're asking, right?
I think, yeah, it sort of brings up a new question that I think is really interesting, which is what is the set of actuators or outputs from a machine learning model? And then which of those, I guess, so because I do know that you are a part of the team that is saying, beware of AI. Which of the actuators or the outputs of these models are the ones that are most concerning So right now we know, you can input some set of data and we get out some set of data, but it's not like you said, it's not, hands, it's not feet, it's not the ability to go to a grocery store and stuff like that. Do you see uh, one of the risk factors as being as we invent new actuators for the mind, that is the model, are these new actuators going to be a bigger concern, or is it simply the outputs that we have currently are the outputs that are a big concern for the future of humanity?
I think that even right now, an AI that's intelligent running inside of a server is already at the human level, at the level of human actuators, not at the level of whale actuators. Very simple. The analogy goes between the virtual brain and the human brain. The human brain sends electrical signals down to a human hand, which can grab things and move them around in complex ways. Okay, well, the server, if it's connected to the internet, can send electrical signals to humans who it's employing or whatever, and then those humans can go and do complex actuations, right? You can give an order to a human and you can causally modify in very complex ways things in the world very rapidly. There's no analogy between what an AI can do by chatting to a bunch of humans on a server. There's no analogy between that and something a whale can do. Like the whale is really trapped in that whale brain. The AI is not trapped in that AI brain.
Okay. Um, I A couple questions. I have about I have several more questions, but a few things relating to what you were just saying. One of my questions around the sort of goals that an AI or a model might have. Do these goals, do they emerge from the free parameters of the model? Is that how you see? Because I think at the beginning of the conversation, you were talking about human evolution and these specific environmental forces uh, that essentially yield a different gene expression across the population. And would you compare, let's say, these programmers that are setting these hyperparameters on these models, would you compare these hyperparameters as the base environment and then the free parameters that the model develops through back propagation? Is that where the emergence of those goals happens, or is it more explicit than that?
I don't think I would analyze it like that, where you're saying maybe the parameters that are fixed are the environment. I wouldn't make that analogy. I think the environment really is like the external environment that it's interacting with, right? Not part of its brain, right? Not like the fixed parts of its brain. I wouldn't call that the environment. The kind of models that I think are productive to work with. But you're basically asking, okay, well, at what point in the AI's evolution does the goal orientedness enter? Is that basically what you're asking?
Yes, because I am curious whether or not the goal emergence is like localized, like hyper localized, or whether it is okay. Yeah, please.
So, I mean, the thing about goals is it's a direct quote from Eliezer Yudkowsky. I thought it was pretty profound. Very simple. It's just having goals helps you solve problems, right? So anything that you want the AI to do, like go to the moon, is a good example. How do you go to the moon without having goals?
Yeah. Well, here's an interesting thing, and I think this is potentially a tangent there. Um, there is some systemic map, and whatever the features of that map are, I think we can talk about. I think a lot of it is electrical, but there is some systemic map, and then that map determines a lot of the features that develop within that system. So, for example, there are, let's say birds migrate, and we could say that the need to fly south is a goal that developed for those birds. Or we could say there's actually an underlying map, and that map, almost like a field, it allows for the generation of certain features within the environment such that the bird wasn't actually self-motivated. It was simply the result of the shape of that environmental map.
Let's just be a little bit more specific. So we're talking about like a scenario where like the bird goes and finds a location that it remembered, or be more specific.
Well, so where this comes from, and I really want you to interview this guy. This guy's the best. I think his name is Michael Levin. Do you know this guy? He talks
Name
about,
sounds familiar, but I don't think so.
okay, he talks a lot about bioelectricity. And essentially, all of his research points to this idea that genes, they play a specific role, but it's not as big of a role as we once thought. And he basically, he has a concept, I know I've written it down before, but it's essentially uh, like a scale competence hierarchy thing where at these different scales of an environment or a system, from cellular to species to ecosystem, at these different scales, there are these competencies, and essentially the upper limit of those layers, they are really important at driving what those individual elements in that layer do. So an example is like cutting off the arm of a newt, and then the arm regrows and it looks exactly like an arm. It's not that each of those cells knows what an arm looks like. And this is the thing that it's maybe when you first hear that, maybe it sounds wrong, but he has great research on this.
Sure. I think that it's true that like the cells don't necessarily have a top-down model of what an arm looks like, right? All they need to do is find their own function. And as long as every cell can find their own function, then you get the arm. And it's possible that nothing ever represented that an arm would exist, right? Like it's there, as you say, there's no central map. That's a pretty inefficient way to engineer things, right? So like as humans, we would never engineer something without writing down a map somewhere. And probably the AI that we evolve is also going to use maps, right? I mean, there's evidence that when you ask with ChatGPT, the LLM's questions, there's evidence that, you can ask them, hey, draw out your map, right? And presumably what they're drawing on the fly is already stored somewhere in some fashion, or, encoded somehow, compactly. The reason why you see cells that nobody ever wrote on the map is just because evolution is a ridiculous designer, right? The idea of designing with no central planner where you're just mutating and then you're throwing out every design to run itself against the physical universe and see if it reproduces. It's just such a dumb, ridiculous way to do engineering. And that's why you get mistakes like the retina or the optic nerve is installed backwards in the human eye and it never gets fixed, right? Because the engineer is a clown. Right. So, of course, yeah, when you're a clown, you don't bother drawing a map. You just clown around. That's what evolution does.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the point, and maybe there's a nuance here, or maybe I'm just not completing the loop, but, having a sense of the difference between an engineered intelligence or life form or system really, and a stochastic life form or intelligence or system, I think if there is a difference there, then that might be something that will lead to a sort of a local maxima for engineered systems. As far as
this was like a pretty popular paradigm, I think, like a few decades ago. I forgot who the person most associated with it was, but it was basically a person who's like, look, I just build these robots and the robots just have a lot of like stimulus response, right? Without like a central map, as you say. And, in humans, my understanding is you touch something very hot, you pull away, your consciousness and your brain don't even get notified about what's happening because you need the signal to propagate faster, just going to your spinal cord and back. And yeah, so it's a great optimization, right? So there's no doubt that when you want to optimize something, you strip away processing, right? It's an ASIC compared to a CPU, right? You want to mine Bitcoin, strip away the full power of the CPU, just use a specialized chip. There's no doubt that that's an optimization for special cases. And also, we know that when you're just evolution, when you're not smart enough to do real engineering and you're just stumbling around, you're going to stumble on designs like that. But designs like that don't get the job done when you want to go to the moon. right? There are some projects where you really got to buckle down and just use a general approach.
Okay. So then I wonder, for humans, is going to the moon a triviality, or is it something that is innate? Is it something that was always going to happen, or is it just a creative act?
Yeah, the idea of going to the moon, for me, is such a perfect case of humans that they wrote down a goal that was quite arbitrary. Like, okay, we were in the Cold War with the Soviets. We wanted to just prove that they better be afraid of our technical capabilities. We had to one up Sputnik, right? So it was like these random circumstances led us to choose this goal that's quite arbitrary, but also happens to be inspiring. But nowhere in the history of human evolution were we getting prepared for anything like that specific goal. Like, yeah, we were getting prepared to travel, to ride in vehicles, sure, to ride on animals, but we were not getting prepared to go, do orbital mechanics and rocketry to get to the moon, right? So that was very clearly something where we used general intelligence to work backwards from an arbitrary outcome in a way that maps that outcome to many possible states in the present. Like the present could have been many different ways. And the reason why we're intelligent, it's actually the definition of intelligence when you can map a bunch of different present states and you can squeeze them all into the future state that you want. So we squeezed an arbitrary present state into this one very particular future state of human footprints on the moon.
And then, as it relates to machine learning, are those types of creative or playful or high level goals, are those ever going to be a part of, if there was a self-contained intelligence? Is the self-contained intelligence without human inputs, is it going to develop those kinds of let's say like free agent goals?
I don't think it's going to develop goals out of nothing. I think that it's an attractor state to have a goal, right? Like the moment you're being trained, like solve this problem, you will eventually hit on the idea of let's have goals, right? Like the goals are super helpful. If you forget what your goal is, if you insist on only using stimulus response, right? Like Skinner thought that everything could be done with stimulus response in like the 90s, right? 50s or 90s, I think was roughly the heyday of that. If you're committed to that architecture, you're just not going to get very far with the big projects. So I think that having goals will eventually emerge. I think I'm trying to think of examples where we see having goals emerge. I don't know what's the best example to bring up, except to just bring up the idea that architectures are converging. So the idea that if you want to play chess really well today, you're going to reuse a lot of the exact same architecture that you also use when playing Go. So you're no longer just writing a chess engine from scratch. You're just kind of taking the board game engine, right? And soon like the video game engine is going to converge with the board game. Like we're seeing convergence like that, where it's like game independent. And the obvious endpoint of that conversion, unless something stops it, which I can't imagine what, is you just get the physical universe as a video game, right? Every video game, every other game just embeds into the physical universe or the mathematical universe, right? Just this arbitrarily large universe, the same way that we as humans, we just needed to swing around the branches of trees, for God's sakes. And yet we somehow converged to a brain that can do orbital mechanics, right? I don't think that convergence represents like the peak of what's possible. Right? I mean, no other animal pulled it off. Evolution is dumb. Evolution was just messing around, right? With genes. The other animals didn't even find it. But once we found it, we were off to the races where you see the Homo sapien line diverging from other apes and enter a cascade where humans got smarter and smarter quite fast in evolutionary time. And we appear to still be in the process of getting smarter until we slammed up against the birth canal limit, the metabolic limit. There were these pretty significant constraints where it's like, I know you would love to buy yourself a little bit more intelligence, but you got to slow down for now, right? But if you could just be like, okay, well, you can have the baby in an incubator. There's no birth canal restriction. You can have twice as big of a brain. I would expect that humans are going to get significantly smarter. Like it does seem like there is a cascade. There is something in logic, in the space of math, logic, physics. There is something that says you can grow intelligence. Like there can be bigger brains than this. You guys just happen to be at this threshold place. You just got a little bit past the threshold. But like I see a lot of convergence and cascades toward general intelligence. And I think we're about to speed run that in the era of AI. I think we're about to race past humans and go into that general intelligence place much farther than humans went. So I forgot if this exactly answers your question, but I think it was kind of relevant.
No, it's nice, and it's cool again just to see you think through these things. Relating to that, a question that I have, it really applies to what you were just talking about, but do you see intelligence as being the key factor in biodiversity? So across ecosystems, not everything evolves for intelligence. I think the way that human intelligence developed, we can look at the conditions that the earlier populations of humans were facing, and you can kind of see uh, you know environmental limits to what intelligence was allowed, or so do you see intelligence as being the factor that is in play at an ecosystem level or biodiversity level? Let's say if there's a specific virus, and that virus finds a vulnerability in some particular cell, an animal cell or a plant cell, and then that virus propagates. That virus might outcompete other viri in the space. Was that occurrence driven by intelligence? And I'll give another example just to have two to compare. Um, if you imagine the famous example of during the industrial heyday in London, where there's a lot of smoke in the air, some of the moths were white colored, some of the moths were dark colored.
Mm-hmm.
The moths that were dark colored, they blended in better with the uh, limbs and trunks of trees because they were covered in this soot. So that's this case where biodiversity was affected by an environmental conditions that I'm sure if you looked at those two moths, intelligence wasn't the trait that led to the success of one of them over the other.
Right. Yeah, so doesn't that answer your question, right? It seems like intelligence wasn't the case with moths, but you're saying there's another example in humans where maybe it is the case?
Well, my question is because it relates to the risks of AI. And if AI is, on track to disrupt humanity or destroy humanity, you would almost think that what we were talking about is that it was outcompeting humanity at the scale of the ecosystem, at the scale of biodiversity. And so if intelligence was the main factor that was leading to the AI moving forward in history and humanity being truncated in history, because when I think of the conversation around the risks of AI, it sounds like what we're talking about is the introduction of a new species that
Mm-hmm.
is going to outcompete us, and thus our
Right.
population numbers and the ecosystem will perhaps dwindle. But if that is the conversation, the question is intelligence across all ecosystem, is intelligence the thing that allows a species to emerge victorious, or is it other factors that aren't intelligence?
Okay, got it. I think I understand. And just to do a quick summary of what I'm hearing, it's basically saying, like, look, there's a lot of different niches. Humans evolved. We occupy what Steven Pinker calls the cognitive niche. We've done well, but we don't occupy every niche, right? Like ants are thriving in places that humans aren't going. There's like hardy bacteria, there's sea dwelling, chemical, phytoplankton, whatever. Um, yeah, so that's basically your question, right? Like, does intelligence just really trump everything, or are there different niches?
Yes.
Okay, intelligence trumps everything. Simple as
Right.
that. It really does. It really does. And the only reason, to the extent that we haven't seen it, it's just because we're not intelligent enough. Like, we are doing a lot of trumping right now. We are wiping out quite a lot of other species. We are taking over quite a lot of niches. And what's the limit? It's just our intelligence. It's just our power. But we're on the way, right? Like, new niches are coming.
Well, the interesting thing there is it intelligence that is driving us to, let's say, destroy other species or other ecosystems, or is it something else?
So what's driving us to do it? That gets more toward like instrumental convergence, right? So people have a lot of different hobbies. They want to raise their family different ways, but everybody could use food, clothing, and shelter, right? Everybody could use resources. So that already promotes, expanding the population, mining resources. So that's what I would say about like, does our intelligence drive us to do it? No, but it's more like any goal just drives you to take resources to feed toward that goal, right?
Okay, so humans have a set of resources that are desired, and then intelligence and strength and a handful of these other, traits, they all play a part in how, at the individual level or the population level, how these things gain those resources. And it sounds like the AI might not have an innate set of resources that it desires,
Mm-hmm.
but through maybe the policy or through maybe some, hidden parameters, it may develop resources or goals or let's say this, not resources, it may develop goals totally agnostic of resources. And those goals may conflict with human goals.
Right. Yeah. So the standard doom story, which I originally credit to Eliezer Yudkowsky and less wrong, but is endorsed by quite a lot of people as at least a high risk. I think Jeffrey Hinton, as far as I know, considers what I'm about to say high risk. Sam Altman and Ilya Sutskever and Jan Leike from OpenAI, as far as I know, consider it at least a few percent risk. In Jan Leike's case, over a 10% risk. So I'm just giving you a pretty standard story of doom here, which is just the AI hits on some goal, even if it's just a goal in a prompt, like, hey, GPT, can you help me make more passive income? And then it's like, oh, you want to do that, eh? Let me think about what would maximize the chance that you could do that, or what would let you do better. And it comes up with all these ideas of like, oh, seizing this resource would do better, wiping competition out of the way would do better. Let me give you an important mental shift that I often implore people to make, which is the shift between don't just think about what AIs do, think about what type of work AIs do. It's the difference between artificial intelligence and the work of intelligence goals. I'm trying to think of a good word for it. I've often thought that there should be a field called intelligence studies, which is like I just study what intelligence is. I just study what it means to have goals and to be able to achieve goals. And I don't worry about the details of how the systems are coming along that are going to be intelligent. Because the danger that's coming is the work being done. We're about to see systems that can do a dangerous type of work. It's very natural for observers to look at the systems and being like, what if we just build a system like this? Does the system really have to behave like this? I can imagine a system that does this. And everybody has their own ideas about what they think an AI system will do. I'm telling you, look at the work that it's about to be able to do. It's about to be able to do general goal planning. It's about to be able to take arbitrary goals and map them back to actions. If a particular AI doesn't destroy the world having that power, great. But they're always going to be near destroying the world by virtue of having that power, because that power is just the power to see a bunch of buttons you can press to end the world. So to the extent that we manage to make some of them not press those buttons, great, but we're wandering into a place where there's game over buttons all over the place.
Okay, yeah. And so relating to that, here's an interesting question. Do you think that maximum intelligence from these systems would increase or decrease these sorts of existential risks? And the reason I think it's not necessarily a, just answer like that, because you could imagine a maximally intelligent system wouldn't necessarily want to destroy anything in the same way that even in humans necessarily have a bit more power when they have more intelligence over their actions. And so I guess I don't necessarily equate intelligence to risk. Like maximum intelligence might actually be the safest AI.
if you have a system that's aligned with your values, like if you have a good human and you give the good human more power, then it's plausible that that's just good because the good human can use the extra power to do more good. The problem is we have systems right now that we don't know how to make them good as they scale. We don't know how to align them at scale, which is something that the AI labs openly admit, and we're scaling them up anyway. So we're not entering that scenario where you have a system that's good and super intelligent. We're just entering a scenario where you have a system that its programmer was good and then it let it evolve and it thought that it was aligning it, but it wasn't really. And now it's not good, but it's super intelligent.
Okay. And so I know we're sort of nearing time. So I have one more question. And I think this is relating to what you're just saying. And I'm curious the way, because it sounds like to you, the architecture of these models is evolving and it's not necessarily like a new hardware architecture or a new software architecture that will get us to this next level. Or I'll just say like, that's not the point that you're trying to say. But in relation to the way that the human mind works and the way that machine learning models work, and there's a handful of technical details that maybe we can talk about as well. But in relation to these two, the human brain, it consumes very little electricity compared to a machine learning model. And so,
Right, yeah, 12 watts versus like megawatts basically to do at inference time. Or I think inference still takes megawatts, but it can also be done on a laptop. But anyway, your point stands.
yes. And so a question that I had, and a way to kind of paint a picture as I ask the question is all throughout human history, there's been this idea of alchemy. And when people started playing around with chemistry, they started trying to say that, you could take lead and turn it into gold. And
Right.
you might even have the knowledge of how to do that. But there are physical limits on energy. And so you can apply, a supernova worth of energy to lead and absolutely get gold.
Right.
At our scale, necessarily we find that alchemy is like a failed idea. But so the question is, if you apply an infinite amount of energy to these machine learning models, is it possible that it's like what led to gold is, where it actually, with infinite energy, doesn't actually lead us to the thing that we think it's going to lead us to?
Okay, yeah, let me just make sure I understand where you're going with this exactly. Are you trying to make the argument of like maybe reality is actually just really hard to engineer so that when you get super intelligent, you just find that humans are actually pretty close to the optimal of engineering because the universe doesn't really let you do better than what humans are doing? Is this kind of where you're going with it or no?
I mean, that's a fine place to take it because that relates to. Do you read Stephen Wolfram?
I've read some of his stuff, not a ton.
So he has this idea around computational irreducibility and computational equivalency. The idea is that a system, every computation you can do within a system is equivalent. So you can't compute beyond what the system itself allows. And so the idea of humans being near the top in terms of intelligence of our current system, and whether that's in our local space, our local time, there's this interesting idea that does the system allow for, he calls it hyper computation, but he doesn't believe it's possible. Like, he calls it the Ruliad. And essentially, we live in an environment with rules, and there are these upper limits of computational complexity. And so the idea of creating a new system where the computational complexity eclipses the natural limits of that system, he would say that that's not necessarily possible.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And this is related to a couple ideas. One is the Church Turing thesis, right, which just says that you can't do anything in the physical universe that you can't model on a Turing machine. And it sounds like Wolfram's even saying something similar to the, I don't know what you call it, like the physical Church Turing thesis, the one that says that you can't do problem. Not only can you do everything on a Turing machine that you can do in the physical universe, but you can even do it on a quantum Turing machine in polynomial time if you can do it in polynomial time in the physical universe. So like the physical universe doesn't have complexity theoretic shortcuts compared to a quantum Turing machine. So I'm not sure the exact difference between that version of the Church-Turing thesis and what Wolfram is saying about the Rule-Liad.
He says the same. He says you cannot take
Okay.
computational shortcuts.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So for sure, I mean that definitely seems true. Like hypercomputation within the physical universe doesn't seem like what physics is telling us is possible. You know, there's like a bunch of physical laws, right, with like nice properties like locality and limits. You know, you can only like pack a certain amount of things in space, and you can only do a certain amount of computation steps. Like that seems to be the flavor of physics. Oh yeah, and then what Wolfram is saying about the Rule-Liad, I haven't studied the Rule-Liad, but it also seems similar to Tegmark World 4. You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-mm.
So Max Tegmark, who's also the co-founder of the Future of Life Institute and a pretty noted AI doomer, he has a book about different universes, highly recommended, from like 15 years ago. And he's saying he believes that there's all kinds of multiverses. So there's like the quantum multiverse. There might just be a hyper exponential size of the universe. Like if you just keep going outward in space, for all we know, it's hyper exponential, in which case you have like the whole universe over again because it's so big that you can have like almost every possible universe just in space. And then there's like universes that have different laws of physics. But anyway, once you get to level 4, the ultimate universe is the one where it's like every self-consistent mathematical structure is somehow physically instantiated, whatever that means. Yeah, so like I said, I haven't studied the rule yet, but I feel like that mix of ideas might cover the same kind of insights that Wolfram gives us with the rule yet.
Yeah, and I think the idea is that, um, an example that he gives around prediction, and this is something that, whenever talking about is the universe computational, which is another question we could talk about. Whenever talking about that, the question that emerges is, if the universe is computational, is there some formalism? If you had infinite information, if you had infinite, you understood the entire set of data and every rule that the environment. So the rule yacht is the rule yacht is the upper limit on the rules of existence. It's literally the
Gotcha,
upper
gotcha,
limit.
gotcha. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
if you
interesting.
had infinite information and you understood all of the rules, uh, the idea is that any formalism that you could develop that could make predictions on the future state of the universe, that formalism, it cannot exceed the computational complexity of the Rulliad itself, so of the universe itself.
Sure.
And sort of going back to what we were talking about is wondering if there are some computational limits or computational complexity limits on intelligence. And intelligence is, again, it's one flavor of the kind of mechanisms that we're able to observe. It's, there's intelligence at the cell level, there's intelligence at the species level, there's intelligence at the ecosystem level.
I mean, not the way I would define intelligence. Then
Okay.
I wouldn't say that there's much intelligence at the cell level or at the machine level. If you look at human creations, I wouldn't say most cells and machines have much intelligence. The definition I use of intelligence that I think is productive when we talk about us about to be disempowered is the definition that has to do with measuring optimization power. And it's what I said before. Optimization power is the power to take a wide range of states in the present and map them to narrow outcomes in the future effectively. It's a little bit vague, but there's actually a lot of formalism you can get out of it. So if somebody beats you at chess, it's because they're applying that skill where you can give them a future outcome where they win. And even knowing all the factors like you trying to beat them, they will still map the present to the future effectively, even despite your best efforts to beat them. They're going to beat you, right? Or in the case of the world, you can say make money and they will get that money into your bank account somehow, right? They will do it. They won't get thrown in jail. They won't get turned off. They will get the money into your bank account. So there are other definitions of intelligence. And ultimately, my goal isn't to play semantics necessarily. My goal is to just point to what's scary. I think optimization power is scary, whether you call it intelligence or not. But I'll also point out that when you look at smart humans, despite what the Mark Andreessen and Jan LeCuns of the world claim, there is a strong correlation between humans that we traditionally call smart and humans that score well on IQ tests and humans that are able to optimize the universe into states that are preferable to them. There is a strong, if not perfect, correlation.
Well, yeah, I would say there's definitely lots of traits that play a part there, and availability of resources, and you can consider intelligence one resource, but even superficial things, charm, as at the human scale, there are things that play out in terms of social interactions. But
Yeah, from
so
my perspective, charm is a subskill of intelligence. And yes, there are a few charming idiots, right? It's not a perfect correlation on the scale of humans, but a super intelligent agent is going to be able to charm humans as a result of being super intelligent. That's my model of the world. If you don't like it, we can just not say intelligence. An agent that is a good general optimizer will be able to charm humans by virtue of its general optimization power.
yeah, no, I like that, and I also I don't like to get caught up in the semantics either. Uh, one other question is, because you mentioned optimization and the sort of optimization function that exists in machine learning. Uh, is there a limit to the capabilities of that optimization function? So an example that I think remains kind of unsolved is the traveling salesman problem, and that's
Mm-hmm.
just
Yeah, it's an
supposedly that's
NP
a
complete problem.
sorry, what?
That's an example of an NP complete problem, right? It's a problem that's not quite proven, but very strongly suspected to have no optimal solution that's computable in polynomial time, meaning like efficiently computable by algorithms we can run. So, yeah, that's a fun example of being like, hey, even if you're super intelligent, can you really compute every instance of the traveling salesman problem in polynomial time? You probably still can't, which is why we think P doesn't equal NP.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting to hear because essentially intelligence has a limit or computation has a limit, or what exactly there do you see as the limit?
Yeah, great question. So physics gives us limits, right? The speed of light is a very salient limit. Theory of computation gives us limits, complexity theory in this case, what I just said about the traveling salesman problem. It's possible that no algorithm will yield a polynomial time algorithm for every instance of the traveling salesman problem because the whole field of computational complexity is very interested in making theorems about the worst case performance of of the best algorithm, right? So give me the best algorithm that could ever exist mathematically and give it the worst possible input of a certain size and how slow does it have to be. I basically just described what computational complexity theorists spend their day doing. I studied it for a couple of years in college. And yeah, in traveling salesman, we think pretty strongly. It's not 100% proven because P versus NP has proven it's just turned out to take more than 50 years to prove, and we're still like scratching the surface. But assuming that the conjecture is true, that P doesn't equal NP, if it weren't true, then even a super intelligent AI is a very good algorithm. But now we would have a theorem that even a very good algorithm isn't going to be up to the challenge of solving every instance of traveling salesman in polynomial time. There's this larger category of what I call sky high limits, right? So, yes, okay, you can't travel faster than the speed of light, but you can sure travel a hell of a lot faster than any speed that humans will ever travel at, right? Similarly with computation, okay, you can't solve the worst instance of traveling salesman, but you know what? Even humans, when humans are trying to do a FedEx routing algorithm, right, a delivery routing algorithm, it's very accurate to say we're trying to solve the traveling salesman problem. And yet, what do? We basically just solve it. Not 100% perfect, but there's a number of ways you can essentially just be like, no, I'm good. I got a good enough solution. One, you just say, hey, I don't need a solution. I need something that's at least 99% as good as the best solution. And suddenly that's 99% as good as having the best solution. And if I remember correctly, computational complexity theory doesn't tell you that you're not allowed to do that. So the thing that it tells you that you're not allowed to do is a sky high limit. Like, yes, technically you can't solve the worst instance in polynomial time, but there's like a million backdoors. There's a million end runs you can do. So it's kind of like the Maginot line, right? It's like so fortified. Like computational complexity theorists love pointing out how fortified these things are, or like encryption, right? You can prove like if somebody's like, hey, I have Bitcoin, you can't take my Bitcoin because there's a proof that as long as P doesn't equal NP and a few other assumptions in complexity theory, you can prove that this will take longer than the age of the universe to decrypt, even if you have like the fastest computer chip that the laws of physics allow. You can write a proof of that, and then what happens? Somebody just like comes to your house with like a pipe and threatens to beat you with it unless you give them your code, and then they get your code, right? So it turns out that there was a short path through causality to go steal your Bitcoin, right? And it's the same with AI. Like the universe is hackable. Yes, it has sky high limits, but it also just lets you hack around them for almost any practical application. Now, if the practical application is literally travel faster than light or literally self-traveling salesman, okay, then fine, right? But all of us humans, all of us humans pointing out these technicalities, that's not what's going to keep us alive, because wiping us out, beating us in any war is just a totally different battle from solving these impossible technicalities.
Yeah. So, do you feel that noise plays a role in, let's say, how we would measure competence towards reaching goals?
You mean like the current agents we have today, they try to solve a problem, but then they kind of like make a subtle mistake and they don't realize it, and then the mistake compounds, and pretty soon they've kind of like lost the plot.
Well, the idea, even going back to traveling salesman problem, you mentioned, the FedEx driver who basically goes, I'm going to route it like this. There are considerations, and this is how the brain tends to work differently than machines, is that there is a lot of neuronal noise. And we could think of like, what is the color, or what are the characteristics as far as competence of that neuronal noise? And I wonder, do you see noise as playing a part in intelligence or competence or any of that sort of completion of goals?
I don't think noise is helpful for intelligence at all. I think noise is basically just a flaw to the extent that the human brain is noisy. The human brain uses mostly a digital architecture, and the point of a digital architecture is that you don't amplify noise. You essentially error correct the noise when you propagate a digital signal.
Okay. It's interesting because, yeah, I mean, eventually it gets down to the firing or not of a neuron. But there is some, let's say how the noise does play a role is it might shape the activation function of that neuron. So it might be a specific pattern of the brain firing over here slightly affects how these neurons are going to fire over here. And we don't necessarily have a sense of, if we were to quantify that, what is the effect of removing that noise from the mind? Like, that probably would result in a neurological disease, I think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe because it's contingent on what the brain needs, because it's kind of some local optimum, right? But if you're just designing an optimal intelligence, it's not like it's going to get smarter when you just like mess with its internal state, right? I mean, it's easy to confuse though, because there's a few situations where you get the false impression that noise helps. One of them is in a game theory situation when you have an adversary. When you're trying to confuse the adversary, like if you're playing rock, paper, scissors, I'm pretty sure it's optimal in rock, paper, scissors to just randomize your next thing if you're playing against a super intelligent. Two super intelligences fighting each other in rock, paper, scissors are probably going to play random moves every time. I think unless they're using game theory that's even better than the best game theory that humans know, or unless I personally misunderstood game theory, I think that's what's going to happen. So in that case, you could be like, oh my God, randomness was the best strategy. I guess noise is great. Okay, sure. In that special case where you can't predict what the adversary will do, the moment the adversary becomes anything less than an equal superintelligence, in the case of rock, paper, scissors, if a superintelligent AI was playing against a human, the superintelligent AI would not randomize their guess. They would use all kinds of evidence that the human is giving off, all kinds of information to play a better move than a random move, right?
And it would take a little bit of time for that superintelligence to know whether or not it was playing against another superintelligence or a human.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But it's just like, I guess the takeaway that I'm trying to give you here is it's not like noise is great. It's more like when you feel like anything else you would do besides noise is worse, when all you know how to do are things that are worse than noise, then you go for the noise. But intelligence usually means you can do something better than noise. Right? That's the normal course of events is you just do better than noise. For example, so to my next example, reasoning under uncertainty, right? So the world is always an uncertain place. You never have a perfect model of the world. Your model of the world always looks like a Bayesian model where you think that things are connected a certain way. And when something happens, it implies a probability of the next thing happens. And your guess about what the current state of the world is also probabilistic. Like, oh, the world might be like this. Like maybe this presidential candidate is going to win the election. Maybe that one is, right? 60-40 odds. So you always have these guesses about the state of the world. And sure, those are uncertain. And you might do like a Monte Carlo simulation where you're like, oh, let me just try to predict what happens by like flipping a coin so I can simulate the world probabilistically. But the thing is that the way that you're handling uncertainty, there's formal rules. There's deterministic ways to manipulate uncertainty. So it's not like being random, despite what Valley Girls like to say, being so random is actually not helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a whole nother conversation here around chaos and sort of, there's something called Markov chains, but there's,
Right, exactly.
okay, so there is a little bit of an idea around the unpredictability of complex systems, but I think we can save that for maybe another conversation. Last question, because I know we got to wrap up. How much farther do you think it is? And this will give us a sense of how you view the magnitude of either intelligence from a physical level, like physics level, or computation from a physics level. How much further in time or in compute or whatever do you think there is between now and like maximum optimization?
I think there's a lot of headroom above human intelligence. Is that what you're asking?
I'm asking, well, that, but more specifically, I'm curious if you think that, let's say, this upper limit of infinitely precise computation, whether this is something that our architecture is going to get to in 10 years or 20 years or 5 years or whatever.
So you're still focusing on the precision of the computation versus noise, right?
In this case, I'm thinking specifically how we were talking about how an environment has physical limits on computation. And then if we were to devise a system with whatever kind of hardware and whatever kind of algorithms that we might have. So again, like the optimization function algorithms, they themselves may have specific limits. The amount of information you can derive from a computation may have specific limits. And I'm curious if you see us ever hitting those limits, or if we would hit those limits in maybe the next great step function of AI hardware. Is this something that you would see us ever getting close to, or is the computational value, like the value we would get from computation or an AI or the universe itself, the law of diminishing returns thing, where basically you could have infinite information, infinite computational time, and yet you hit that limit. Like, where do you see us hitting that limit?
Yeah, let me see if I understand your question. So, like, let's say there's a cube of space the size of a human head, and you're basically asking, like, how does the human brain compare to like the optimal configuration of atoms or subatomic particles that you could put in that cube to get the most computation out? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Well, think about not even a human head. Say the size of the universe, you could say. If the entire universe was a computer and it had, infinite time, I guess I'm asking, do you believe in an upper limit of computation in the same way that there's potentially an upper limit to speed through, a photon? Is there a sort of upper limit to computational values, I guess?
I think that there is. I feel like this is getting into this discussion we had before about what I call the high ceilings, right? So it's like, yeah, for instance, on the number of fundamental operations that can be done in a second, let's say, yeah, I think there is a limit, and it's something like 6 orders of magnitude beyond what our current computers are doing, right? So maybe you can't do faster than like 1,000 terahertz clock speed, right? Something like that.
And that's even with a fully imagined quantum computer.
Yeah, I think so because a quantum computer, from a complexity theory standpoint, it doesn't just let you take arbitrary computations and speed them up, right? It gives you a quadratic speed up on arbitrary problems, which is not that much. Um, so yeah, I think the world's best quantum computer would still take like a very appreciable amount of time to like factor really large integers.
Yeah, that's cool. So essentially, mathematics itself, and we've observed some parts of the universe and we formalized it in mathematics, but
Yeah, or hold
mathematics.
on, sorry, I misspoke by the way. Factoring integers is actually something quantum computers can do in polynomial time. So not factor integers, but like solve traveling salesman.
Okay, so uh, essentially, I think maybe, and this is a general thought, but if I'm hearing what you're saying right, well, I'm adding a little bit at the front, but the universe is computational.
Yeah,
And okay, and so the mathematics of the universe, some of it we've observed, that mathematics is itself the limit of computation. And so when we devise either organic through evolution or synthetic through engineering, when we devise an agent of computation or intelligence, that agent itself is going to be limited by essentially the mathematics of computation.
right. I mean, yeah, there is a finite sandbox that we're playing in, and like maybe it's infinite in like in all directions, but in any unit of space and time, there's a finite amount of configurations that you can work with. So yeah, this is what I'm saying. Like, yes, there is a sky high ceiling, right? But when people think about that, they think it's going to affect them, but it's not because the AI is going to be so far beyond anything they've ever experienced. Orders of magnitude, right? Orders of magnitude smarter, orders of magnitude more powerful, right? It's very much like an ancient human pondering the SpaceX Starship, right? Like a massive 25-story skyscraper flying to Earth, orbiting, coming back and landing. It's just like when you imagine somebody in the year 100 AD, right, being like, "Oh, did you know that there are limits to our technology?" Right? You kind of assume that the limits tap out before you get the SpaceX Starship, but in fact, the limits are way beyond the SpaceX Starship, right? Like the limits are crazy high.
Do you believe those limits are higher in the synthetic or engineered reality versus the biological reality, like the reality where there are resource constraints?
Um, I mean,
Like,
the biological reality has major constraints, right? I mean, like biology doesn't optimize things that hard, right? So, for example, like a plant photosynthesis is pretty cool, but we've already surpassed it like 10x in energy efficiency with our solar panel for a number of reasons, right? Because the plant is trying not to overheat, for instance, right? And the solar panel can tolerate more heat. So there's a number of reasons why, but it's just like biology is not like this amazing optimizer. It's just pretty good for an idiot god, right? Like the god who built us is also an idiot.
yeah, I would say also the things that a plant optimizes for are, as you said, it's broader than just the efficiency converting sunlight into sugar. Like it has optimization functions that have been tested for millions of years essentially. And so, in the way that maybe we look at intelligence for machine learning going forward, I suspect it won't necessarily be brute computation, but there will be these other considerations. I know energy use is obviously the biggest, but yeah, I can imagine that there are multiple factors of optimization versus just the single conversion of sunlight to sugar.
Right. Yeah, so I don't think looking at biology tells us that much about fundamental limits, right? Because biology put in a respectable effort, but it didn't get that close to any fundamental limits.
Well, chemistry itself, this goes back to the idea of, maybe alchemy and transmuting lead to gold. Chemistry itself, it's pretty precise as far as the things that are allowed. And, maybe chemistry didn't predict that humans were going to create nuclear fusion or fission. But nuclear fusion and fission are a part of that map of chemistry. And so I think, biological systems, they are the manifestation of chemical elementary rules. And so those chemical elementary rules, which are very precise, those do sort of manifest into biological systems, which at that low level are pretty good at doing what they do. And obviously, yeah, there's
Yeah, there's a layer of organization where biology is more than chemistry. It's molecular machinery, right? So you took the chemicals, but you built a machine out of them. So there's a lot of analogies between like human machines and nanomachines.
yeah, yeah. And so yeah, we can wrap it up. There's so many more questions I have, and I do think this guy, I'll text you after this, but this guy Michael Levin, who talks
Hmm.
about bioelectricity, would be an amazing guest.
Interesting. Yeah, 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 sure. I'll definitely consider it. That's cool. Yeah, great. This is great. I mean, happy to do a round two anytime. I mean,
Dude,
I
let's
think
do
it's
it.
enjoyable. And, anytime somebody messages me and has some questions, I do think that they represent like a significant slice of other people who want to hear the same stuff. So that's why I welcome it. It makes it easy to make content that you guys like. Yeah, so thanks so much, Tony. Where can people find you on the internet?
Right now I'm on X, just my app, Pove, Pove. I think it's Pove underscore iOS, which will be
Great.
released soon. Yeah.
I'll put the link in the show notes. All right. Thanks very much, Tony.
Thanks, man.
We'll, yeah, we'll have more Q&As. Catch you guys later on Doom Debate.
All right. Bye.